Welcome to the Bitter Medicine Podcast, where it's all about Black empowerment. Our show focuses on Black news and entertainment, arts, science, economics, history, people, and strategies that uplift, empower, and motivate Africans within the diaspora. And now, your host, whose favorite color is black, Goku.
Welcome back to the Bitter Medicine Podcast. I am your host, Kopu. Today we're back again reading a bit of literature. This time it's titled The Origins of African Kingdoms. Before I get into the reading, as you know, I like to do this every time. I want you guys to make sure to support by liking and subscribing and listening to other shows on KWAZ radio. Like these shows, for example.
This is DAX. You tune into the Harsh Reality Podcast, providing you with social commentary on the news affecting our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-Black perspective, where Black problems are addressed with Black solutions.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Yes, indeed, you are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio. It's a Thursday night, so you know that there's an episode to be done. And this episode that we're talking about is the origins of African kingdoms. And I have a follow-up episode to this one on Saturday night, so set your reminders now, Saturday at 8. I will be back to do another episode talking about African kingdoms again. So without further ado, let's get into tonight's reading. Let me just make sure I have my stuff set up here. Back to do another episode. All right. So now we're ready to go. Okay. So the origins of African kingdoms. The problem of the origins of African kingdoms is closely linked to the general theoretical problem of state formation. Various writers' views of the processes of state formation have influenced the writing of African history, while on the other hand, the conquest theory of the state has often been supported with African material. See, for example, Meinhof in 1912, Jones in 1961, Ratzel in 1898, Oppenheimer in 1914, etc. It has been widely held that most of the states of Africa were formed by conquest by which peoples of one culture subjugated peoples of other cultures, producing societies with sharply divided classes of rulers and subjects. For a recent statement on this position, see Oliver and Phage, 1962, page 46. This paper suggests that the conquest hypothesis oversimplified the processes of state formation and of African political history and presents a number of alternative ways by which African states have been formed. So, but what that's basically saying is that, you know, we rushed to our thought and theory on African, state formation based on our own European ways of state formation, right? So now they're trying to kind of reconsider the thought. We must make an initial distinction between primary or or pristine and secondary or derived states, because they may come about in different ways. Primary states are ones which arise without the stimulus of other pre-existing states through processes of internal or regional development. Such states develop in the Nile Valley, Mesopotamia, China, Peru, and Mexico, but seem empirically to be relatively rare. However, given the presence of one kingdom in a region, it is most likely that it will give rise to others, and it is demonstrable that the vast majority of Asian and European kingdoms arose in response to stimuli from previously established states. It is probable also that most of the kingdoms of sub-Saharan Africa were secondary states. The question now is, in what ways do states give rise to others? So this is the fundamental question of the paper, right? In what way do states give rise to others, right? They say that the Asian and European kingdoms arose in response to stimuli from previously established states, right? And so now they're looking at the African, particularly sub-Saharan African states or kingdoms that arose, and what was the impetus for their beginnings. The commonest way in which monarchy is spread is through simple geographical extension of the borders of a kingdom. This involves some conquest, but it is different from that envisaged by conquest theorists. It can involve an expansion of agriculturalists to control other agriculturalists or similar ethnic background and level of culture, as when the Nupe, Maasai, Ashanti, Bemba, Ganda, or other agricultural and Negro groups expanded their states to include their neighbors. Regardless of whether a state's immediate neighbors are pastoral or agricultural, sedentary or nomadic, of the same or of a different linguistic background, it is virtually certain that its rulers will attempt to extend their sovereignty as far as possible. The states of Toro, Nyoro, Nkole, Oyo, Dahomey, and the empires of Mali, Songhai, and all managed to aggrandize themselves, expanding into contiguous areas. Southall has also demonstrated that the extension of state domination can be accomplished through the voluntary acceptance of chiefs by non-monarchical peoples desiring the symbolic, ritual, legal, or political gains they can derive from them. Winans reports this process for the Shambhala of Tanganyika. In these cases, no conquest is involved. So far, they're saying something that's important to understand too. Circumstances might make you create a state, right? And hopefully later on the paper touches on, you can't build a state without certain advantages, right? And by that I mean certain ways in which the state of the nation, you can't build it unless you have a way to sustain its people, right? Like they talked about for a second there, you could have pastoralists who join together around the idea, not around the idea that the cultures might are the same or they're the same people, but around this thing that's the driving force for their people, right? This economy, if you will, right? As farmers. right? They will bind together and create these nations. And so the same thing is true today, right? You have different African people. And it's always funny to hear some folks talk about African folks as, we ain't all a monolith. Well, yeah, we know that, you goddamn sellout, but we can be a monolith in our goals and in our thinking, right? We have to understand the need for the nation, right? Which is what they're talking about in this part of the paper, right? There's sometimes, a people will join together in nationhood, right? Because they see a chance to join in, like and to enjoy some of the desirable aspects of being in a nation, right? Like they said here, be it symbolic, ritual, legal, or political, right? There's gains to being together. And so, when, like, for example, when Oni Tese was working on his revolutionary writing project, one of the things I suggested to him, if you listen to that episode, is, you gotta, up front and center, you gotta tell the people the benefits. And as he added on this show in the comment section a couple episodes back, you gotta also tell them what are the punishments for not joining together, for not getting organized together, for not becoming a nation, right? And so it's similar here you see in history, right? So as we read this, we should see more of the same. We should see where the people are joining together because of the benefit, up front and center, but also because of the punishment or the potential punishment of not joining into these nations. And they don't have to be the exact same peoples. That's the point I'm trying to get across here. They don't have to be the exact same peoples. They don't have to have the exact same cultures. There's the benefit that they're concerned with, and by rights also the punishment, right? The attempt to control one's neighbors often produces reactions and results which were unintended by the rulers of the expanding states. In many cases, the kings' representatives in newly won areas seek their own independent power. If a governor or vassal is able, he may defy the king, set himself up as ruler in his own area, and then try to defeat the army sent against him. If he wins, a new kingdom is created, and the new ruler in his turn will begin a series of expeditions to collect tribute and bring new lands and people into his realm. Toro became independent of Nyoro in this manner. In Nupe, governors and generals in outlying areas constantly threatened to become independent, and several Maasai kingdoms were founded in this manner. Among the Ngoni, according to Barnes, in 1955, there was a continual growth of new small states as dependent chiefs gathered their own followers, took over new lands, and became independent rulers. Richards points out that the tendency for royal chiefs to declare their independence was a major cause of the proliferation of little kingdoms in the Sogahaya, Nyamwezi, and Sukuma areas, as well as in South Africa. In another type of unanticipated consequence, states which collected tribute and tried to control their neighbors may stimulate them to rebellion and to develop their own strong leaders and complex organization in order to withstand the attacks of the monarchy. The foundations of Ashanti and Dahomey, and possibly Nupe, are examples of this type of development. So let's look at this again. In another type of unanticipated consequence, states which collect tribute and try to control their neighbors may stimulate them to rebellion and to develop their own strong leaders and complex organizations in order to withstand the attacks of the monarchy. This is true. This is a human condition, right? You start to ally up against this, this more powerful machine, the strength in numbers. And that's something we forget a lot too. Like, as Black folks, like, you want to go where you have numbers. That's where you're strongest. That's where you're strongest. So when you hear it said that, well, like in America, you're just a population within a nation, that's true. And so what you want to do, you want to actually join in with others. In the Caribbean, the problem there is that even though it might be more or less a better situation in terms of the number of Africans you have in the Caribbean, the problem is it still is, the numbers still are too small, right? So again, it all comes back to you have to have this strong continent, right? This continent of folks like ourselves, right? This powerhouse. You still need that to be able to extend protections for people outside of it, but ideally, as time passes by, our people need to really return back to the power base that the continent can be. The Ashanti Union arose as a confederation of largely independent communities joined together to fight Denki era. They drew upon Denki era and other states for the model of their system, but the development of the monarchy was precipitated by the rewards from and the need for war organization. Again, you see that term, that word war often comes up, right? You better grow your numbers to be better organized for war, which led to control by an indigenous leader. It is probable that many states began in this way, but it may be difficult to tell from the literature whether historical traditions mirror secession and development inspired from above, by, say, for example, by a vassal ruler, or more fully local development. The Nupe and Maasai cases could be of either type. Let's go back and highlight this point here. In a related case, the Basotho Kingdom was formed when a number of local groups and refugees in need of protection from the Zulu and Swazi states banded together around the leadership of Moshesh, right? I talked about Moshesh last time. Another common type of state formation involves military victories and losses, but again on a local scale. In areas of dense population, closed resources, possibly a nearby strong kingdom where there is a rich reward for war in terms of land, cattle, or the control of trade routes and tolls, local groups may begin to wage serious wars among themselves under the direction of war leaders. I like that term, war leaders. Frequently, these groups are on the same linguistic and cultural background. In time, one may come to dominate its neighbors and a small state will develop. It is possible that the origins of some primary states may be explained through processes such as these. Sometimes such kingdoms continue to expand to considerable size and strength. A classic example is Shaka Zulu state. And you'll notice something too, like, of all the war leaders we've had in Africa, right? Shaka Zulu is the one they talk about the most. And because Shaka Zulu and you know, there was a movie made about it, books have been written about it, and as I've mentioned here on the show before, Shaka Zulu and his tactics of war still studied and have been co-opted and used by, you know, the Europeans and like the British and the Americans in their war strategies. That's how significant the work that him and his people put in, right? It's still studied to this day. They bring it up all the time, right? The classic example is Shaka Zulu state, but Buganda, according to Richards, the Swazi state, and possibly some Soga groups may have developed in much the same way. In Ethiopia, the Gala developed at least 3 and probably 7 different kingdoms in this manner. Gala leaders defeated their rivals and new kingdoms were born at the edge of Abyssinia and Kaffa. The older kingdoms served as models and their pressure added to the need for warfare. And so these are still secondary states rather than primary ones. In the light of much African historical writing, it's important to note that no Gala kingdoms arose from the conquest of indigenous agricultural populations. Many writers have considered the Gala to be the archetype of the conquering pastoral Hamite. For example, Roscoe, Johnson, Seligman wrote about this idea. But these Ethiopian Gala were sedentary, mixed agriculturalists. They did not develop their states until 200 years after they had taken over their territories in Western Ethiopia. And they took their land from other Cushitic speaking peoples. This supports Fred's point, 1961, that a people must first have developed their own indigenous power structure before a state can result from their conquest of another group. There is no Gala kingdom with Rwanda's or Nkolo's system of stratification based on ethnicity or occupation. Finally, there are several important kingdoms in Africa in which people with a bias for cattle rule agriculturalists. There are not many, but they have been sources of inspiration for conquest theorists from Ratzel on. In the case of the Fulani Empire, and one of the things I want to get across here is a part of the reason why I do these readings is so that when these names come up, right, these names of African peoples, tongues, nations, etc., that you have a reason to then go and look up these folks, right? You have a reason to look up the Fulani or the Mosai or what have you, the Nkolo or what have you. It gives you a reason to look up and to look into their histories a little bit deeper. One of my aims in the future is to really like do a deep dive and look up these folks and present something to you that we could really really learn something and have a greater discourse, right? Let me look at something in the chat room here. Someone, question mark, asks, how can one overcome social anxiety due to racism? Another question is, where does the Ashanti people derive from? And another question was, I just gave you a like. Please answer my question. So I guess this person believes that a like means you control what I do now. Okay. So social anxiety is a disorder and really a mental health condition, right, that is centered around fear of being looked upon and judged by people. A lot of people suffer this, right? But if you're going to ask it with regards to, if you're going to ask that question, right, how to overcome social anxiety in the face of racism. Well, number one, you got to depower. You have to depower the magnitude or your belief in the power of racism. See, one of the problems we have in our society right now, a lot of our people go around listening to some of these talking heads out here who say to you, you know, white folks are the smartest, or the white supremacists are the smartest people on the planet. Or no matter where you go, white supremacy is there and it'll dominate you and all this old shit, right? But the fact of the matter is, like, you gotta stop thinking that, right? And you gotta understand what's really going on with this thing called, which a lot of people call, or most people for simplicity call, like, white supremacy, right? You gotta understand that white folks are really just being nationalists, and they're really just kind of building or maintaining their nation. And so once you understand that what we call racism is white folks looking out for white folks, building and maintaining, their power, then you'll understand exactly what you need to do. What you need to do is counter their effort. And how old are you, by the way? Double question mark. How old are you? Because there's a certain age threshold, I believe, where, one would really care about, people looking at them and judging them and stuff like that, right? But beyond a certain age, that shouldn't be so much of a worry for you. So when I hear that question, 26, when I hear that question, I always think of someone pretty young. At 26, though, you're reaching the age where you shouldn't be too focused on others too much. You do you, and everything you do it with a confidence. And this is why if you've been listening to this show in the past, which I feel like you haven't, but if you have been listening to the show in the past, this is why we talk about, like, how the education, right? The education, and are you black? Double question mark. Because if you are, then you'll know that it's the education. You just said something that's interesting too. You said, but I've been deeply brainwashed with Christianity, and that's the thing. The problem with a lot of religion, the way it's presented to people, to black people in particular, we always have a master. The problem with most religion is that we always have a master. There's always something greater than us. And so when you operate in that world, you would think kind of less of yourself in a sense. There's always something greater than you. And so what we got to start getting to is understanding that, hey man, I know if you want to use the word God, for example, you know, you got to understand that you are the God. You are the God who's able to create, you know, who's able to do for self. You know, and when we start thinking about of ourselves as these, you know, as these gods, you know, and we start to get rid of this religious thinking that there's always some master over us. I mean, the Bible literally talks about masters a bunch, like especially in the Old Testament, right? Once we get past that, then you will be better off in life for it. So let me put the thought all together. The thought is this: what we need to do as Black folks, you included, is understand who we are, where we came from, the dope stuff that we did in our history, and understand that we didn't have no white daddy or mommy holding our hands to do it. We did that shit. They came along, they copied it, then they destroyed it, they detached us from it, right? And so with many of us, especially at certain ages, we pass through kind of an inferiority complex. But hopefully the fact that you're here says that hopefully the fact that you're here says that you're trying to get rid of, you know, those mental chains that make you feel inferior, that make you feel that you're being watched and judged, right? Especially in the context of quote unquote racism, right? But the thing you got to do is you got to get that religious thinking up off of you. Anything that's telling you that you have a master and no matter what you do is destruction for you. And like I've said on the show in the past, man, anything, if you take this European philosophies, you're gonna end up in destruction. Remember, European philosophy is written for European people. And if you're not that, then you feel less than in that philosophy. Okay? I hope I was able to answer that question. Hold on a second. I see Donaldson is here. He says, you are a creator. Yes, you are. So let me go back to the comments. Sorry, I'm a little bit behind. Sometimes I listen. Yes, Ashanti, Ghanaian, living in Europe. Okay. I am the creator. Yeah, you are a creator. Absolutely. We gotta come off of this inferiority complex, and the whole history since our contact with these European folks would make you feel less than, and so that's why when, I don't know if you're familiar with Carter G. Woodson and his work, you know, the miseducation of the Negro, but that's why they set up these curriculum around the world like that. The curriculum is meant to bolster the self-esteem of their people and diminish the self-esteem of our people. When you go into a school setting and all you learn about is, you know, Greek mythology, European conquests, Alexander the Great, and all these type of clowns, then you don't see yourself in that, right? So you will feel small, but you have to detach yourself from what these Europeans are giving you in the schools, and you got to start to suckle at like more Afrocentric, more African-centered learning, more African-centered thought. I mean, we have all these great writers out here. There's one in the chat room right now. He was LOLing a second ago. Go and pick up Onitase's books, right? Book of Power. I mean, think about the title of that book, right? Go pick up the Pro-Black Compendium. Go pick up, you know, as a matter of fact, go back and listen to some of the shows that we did when we had the book club, talking about some of those books, right? I mean, just the idea that we had our own system of martial arts that no one talks about. Everyone talks about this Roman shit and this Asian shit, right? No one talks about like the martial arts systems that we had. You know, of course you feel small, and I you know, I feel for you because I know what it is to feel that way, right? And another thing, you're in a similar predicament, if not a worse one, than those of us in America. You're around these folks in Europe again. You mentioned earlier I think you're in the UK or in Europe or something like that. Yeah, living in Europe, a Ghanaian living in Europe, and dude, like, if you want to feel inferior anywhere, I mean, Europe is like the first destination I'll book on a flight if I want to feel inferior. That's like the first destination I'd go to if I want to feel inferior. Yes, I'm on my way rejecting Christianity. It was my father who taught or forced me to church almost every day. I listened to Amos Wilson often, and he helped me see through lies of the European. His words, in order for us to be in this position, our African minds have to be reversed. And you're in Germany? Come on, man. Come on, you're in the worst place you can be. Right? And you know, others in the chat room have given you some advice, right? So look at the advice that they've given you as well. But I mean, you're in the right direction. The biggest thing, you got to get that religious thing off of you, man. I grew up, and I've talked about this in the show before too. I grew up in the church, heavy. And there's something I call, and I think even the church calls it that too, but I define it differently. There's something called the age of reason. You've got to reach a certain age where you got to get rid of what's not serving you and boost up the things that are serving you. And that religious stuff doesn't serve us. I mean, think about it. Like, in the time when, you know, our enslaved ancestors were not, quote unquote, allowed to read, right? The Bible was okay though, right? Religion was fine. Not your indigenous religion, but their religion was fine. Their religious books were fine. You gotta question that kind of stuff. You know, you asked me to explain. I've been explaining. I think what I was saying when you probably sent that was, you know, you cannot be living in the midst of Europeans and in their nation and feel empowered or not without a strong, grounded bit of education, bit of knowledge of self. Can you really be in the midst of these European folks and not be affected, right? Because you're going to be the lowest person on the rung of the ladder, and you're going to be reminded of it daily in all aspects of life. Once you're around them, that's just how you're going to feel. In America, we are around them, but it's, to my knowledge, it's a little bit different. That our numbers are bigger, and our daily lives tend to be around each other more or less, except for in the cases of like work and stuff like that. But it's a little bit different for us here, and I'm not saying that it's much better either, but it is a little bit different. All right. So I'm glad that you're at the age of awakening. Stick around, check out the other shows on this podcast network, and you should be fine. But there's also great readings to be done too. Don't just watch videos too. That's another thing a lot of our youth are doing now. You're only watching videos. Actually sit down and hold a book in your hand and do some reading and some thinking. If you want to send me an email, ask me how to join the discourse and the Discord. And I have a lot of free books in there. I have a lot more to put up in there that you could just jump into and read. You could also find your way to the Pro-Black Perspective podcast and the work that he's doing and join in there if you haven't already. But this is the right path to be on. Okay. So I was reading this paper, forgot where I was, so I'm just going to start here. And by the way, this is a short paper. I might end up doing a little bit more discussions with the chat room in this episode. So anyway, let me go here. Finally, there are several important kingdoms in Africa in which people with a bias for cattle rule agriculturalists. There are not many, but they have been sources of inspiration for conquest theorists from Ratsalon. In the case of the Fulani Empire, however, we know that states existed in their area for hundreds of years before these partly pastoral people gained extensive political control over a number of kingdoms. This is probably a good indication of how the Rwanda, Burundi, and Ankoli states got their Tutsi and Hima rulers. It is reasonable to assume that the Tutsi and Hima took over kingdoms which were already in existence, just as the Fulani did, infiltrating into the area as herders, or perhaps representing the original inhabitants who were swamped by an influx of Bantu agriculturalists. At some point, they must have engineered a series of coups and taken over the kingship established by the agriculturalists. This is not the place to discuss the problem, but the prevalence of monarchy among the Bantu and its absence amongst the Nilotic pastoralists and the low position of Hima herders elsewhere in the Lake District suggests that we are not dealing with primary states of Nilotic herders over farmers. According to Vansina, personal communication, there is clear evidence that Rwanda was well established before the Tutsi revolution, and there are indications of the same thing in Burundi. I do not claim that these are the only ways in which secondary states may be formed. I realize that these types I have isolated may be combined in various ways, and that it is not always clear from traditions just which processes are involved in particular cases. Right? But it is clear that there is no evidence for a widespread and recurrent pattern of conquest, certainly not by members of a particular culture, a special language group, or one remarkable royal family. So, again, this author is kind of pushing back against this idea, I guess, that, maybe African, what's the word I'm trying to find? Maybe African kingdoms came about the same or similar in a way that European kingdoms came about, which was basically conquest. I've talked about it on the show, and you guys should know this by now, but, the whole thing with Europe was a bunch of these tribes, these warring tribes. A lot of them, because of where they were located. They were uncouth, and because of where Rome was located. I mean, look at a map to see where Italy is, right? Because of where Rome was located and Rome's history with the Greeks, and the Greeks' history with infiltrating Kemet and learning Kemet, learning all of Kemet's knowledge and stuff like that. The Romans were more sophisticated, so to speak, Europeans than the rest of the tribes up in Germany and Russia and stuff like that. And so a big thing that Rome was worried about was if those guys descended on Rome. Remember, Europe was kind of held up by this one place called Rome. And their worry was that if those guys descended upon Rome and destroyed it, that the people will become, just a backward group of people. And why would you worry about that? Well, they saw what was going on in Kemet. They knew what advancement looked like. And they knew that if they fell behind, based on the way they think, remember, these are savages, right? They probably felt that Africans would have, done them as dirty as they ended up doing us. And so we have to understand that, once again, we can't be thinking like Europeans because we're not Europeans. Europeans tended to look at us, and in fact, they still do compare us in terms of their mindset. But we're just different people. We're fundamentally different people, right? And this last sentence here is key to that. It's clear that there's no evidence for a widespread or recurrent pattern of conquest. We weren't just blowing people out in war and then taking their lands and all that kind of stuff. A lot of times it was like, mutual understandings of what we need to do. Like there was a time where we as a people really understood how to build nations. And we understood the benefits of being together. And now we don't understand the benefits of being together. We don't understand the benefits of being connected, right? And again, it wasn't about a particular culture. It wasn't about a special language group. It wasn't about some made up, royal family, or as they put it here, some remarkable royal family, like what you see in the UK and stuff like that. It was just sensible moves. And we don't make sensible moves anymore, right? The process of secondary state formation, which I have categorized here, are all found in Asia and Europe, as well as in Africa. We must also assume that similar processes operated in the foundations of such great states as Mali, Songhai, Kanem, Darfur, Wadai, and Tekrur. It is reasonable to hypothesize that the kingdoms of the Nile had a direct bearing on the development of a number of secondary states in the eastern Sudan and western in the eastern Sudan and western Ethiopia. But once the new states were formed and new ruling groups arose, these kingdoms would have begun to extend their power, and they in turn would thereby have stimulated the spread of monarchy. It is unreasonable to search for the origins of the Jukun kingdom of Norororofa, in the Nile, when the Jukun were in constant and immediate contact with Bornu, Saraya, and other old and well-developed states. It makes little sense to seek the origins of the Songhai or Hausa states in conquest by North African or East African immigrants, when we know that the Western Sudan had great empires at least several centuries before the birth of Islam. Yeah, that's the thing, you know, speaking of speaking of Islam here again, right? It's true, when I was growing up, it was always kind of put out there. It was always kind of put out there that the great African kingdoms were Islamic, but even before, even these authors here are telling you, before the birth of Islam, you had great kingdoms in the Sudan area, right? In the chat room, Mr. Donaldson says Greece and Rome are Mediterranean states more so than European. Europe is a modern social. I mean, Europe, right? So in its time, you're correct. In its time, you know, they weren't calling themselves Europe, but if we look at, if I'm not mistaken, if we look at the progression of Europe, Europe was influenced heavily by Rome, and Rome was influenced, but so it's like a trajectory, right? You go from Kemet to Greece to Rome, and the hope was that Rome would spread out into further up into what's now called Europe, right? Double question mark says to KW Don 7, yes, as well as the Middle East as a social construct in order to separate Black people from disconnecting from it, northern part of Africa, Egypt, or Kemet. Yeah, so where was I? It is unreasonable to, no, that's not it. The conquest theory of state formation is not sufficient for an understanding of the dynamics of monarchical organization, and it is misleading as a hypothesis for the study of events of African history. The conquest theory of state formation is not sufficient for an understanding of the dynamics of monarchical organization, and it is misleading as a hypothesis for the study of the events of African history. The kingdoms of Africa were not formed through any single process or by any one cultural, economic, or ethnic group. In Africa, as elsewhere in the world, the origins of each state must be considered in its own right. This is done, a number of repetitive patterns of development are discernible. The discovery of such limited but recurrent patterns will contribute to the study of both political processes and African history. So my question to you guys in the chat room, seeing that the chat room is active, what is, and make sure to hit the like button, guys. Like, subscribe, share, etc. Make sure to hit the bell so that you'll be notified when I'm on live again, which should be Saturday night at 8 p.m. But since I got the chat room here and there's some activity, what does this paper really say to you about the nature of Africans, about African nation building, right? And about the idea that I've pushed on this show before, that we really shouldn't see ourselves in Eurocentric ways. What do you guys have to say to those three things? And whatever you type in the chat, I'll read out live on the show, and we'll talk about it. Yeah, a lot of our scholars have said that Europe is really just West Asia, which is in part why I think the term Eurasian is often used. Double question mark said, some people even say there's no such thing as Europe. Then what is now called Europe is actually West Asia. Hey, these constructs of these land constructs that Eurasians put out there is wild, man. Like, you know, I had a buddy not too long ago was arguing with a white guy about where Israel is located. You know, to you guys, and maybe you guys know already in the chat room, but where is Israel located? You know, these guys will tell you something wild that, Israel is located in Asia or something like that. You know, but look where it's located. No more questions, no more comments. When I wanted y'all to talk, you don't talk. And when I'm reading the stuff, you're talking a lot. All right, so that's the paper. Seems like I don't have any more comments. That's the paper. It was a short paper tonight. The next paper I will discuss will talk about, will be about the comparisons of African kingdoms, which should be a good one, and I'll be doing that on Saturday night. In the chat room, our friend double question mark says, it means that we have been deeply brainwashed, and as you already said, we have to reject their worldview and replace it with African worldview, as Dr. Amos Wilson also said. Kevin says, African people have to stop using the Urugu as a benchmark for civilization. And well, yeah, I mean, that's absolutely true. But you see, that's the thing. That's why I keep talking about this African-centered curriculum, because you got to understand the problem with our people is that from a young age, like I was reading this paper the other day on a live stream that was talking about how, like, in Africa, in the continent itself, I think it was last Saturday, in the continent itself, like, they're instructed in school in a European language since like grade 1 or something like that, right? The reach into your mind happens so early that, to be honest, if we're being completely honest, even a lot of the folks who would say that they're like conscious or woke still carry, you know, some of the marks of you know, Eurocentric thought. You know, there's a young lady on Twitter. She's what you would call a Black Brit. I won't put her name out there, but she's on Twitter, and she insists. And one day I had to say something to her about it. She insists to call like Caribbean people like West Indians, and I know we grew up hearing that all the time, but we ain't Indians. But to say what, you know, to say Caribbean or you know, Africans in the Caribbean is, she can't fathom it, and she's quite comfortable and you know, continues to push the idea of the West Indian. And that's because, like, in the UK where she's from, she probably lives in one of these Caribbean spots, right? Where everyone still calls themselves West Indian and, British West Indies and all that old shit. And that's the problem. Like, we've been, it's been handed down to us. We've been schooled in it for so long that, in fact, I think that's the most difficult part of consciousness to begin with. And this is by design. They know this. So what Double Question Mark is talking about in the chat room, I fully understand what he's saying. I understand what he's going through because it's something that's handed down. Like he said, his father pushed the whole Christianity thing on it, right? It's pushed down on it. It's pushed down on us so much. Then you go to school and everything you hear in school is about how great the Europeans are, right? So the only way we could combat that is combat it with education that's more centered to us and our tradition. In the chat room, Double Question Mark says Israel is located in Africa but not in Asia. KW Dawn 7 says Israel is Northeast Africa. Double Question Mark says, in fact, the country referred to as Israel was called Canaan, which was the son of Ham, burned one, and Ham's sons were all black, and Egypt and all dark-skinned people of Africa were the sons of Ham. Okay. So even the Holy Scriptures tell us that Egypt was part of the dark African race. Correct. Right? And I had a conversation with Cambone a couple weeks back. The audio was messed up, and the audio was messed up. But one of the things he was pointing out and trying to get across to our people is that the original name for that region of Africa was Kemet. The black lands or land of the black people. And so we got to understand who we are. And that's the problem. Like, if you think you have a problem with it still at 26, there's some people who still have the problem at 70. There's some people who have died today still having this problem, still being gripped by these Europeans and their propaganda called religion. Even though it's quite obvious where so-called Israel is located, these guys will tell you it's in Asia. And we just go along with this foolishness. We just go along with the foolishness all the time. And so, again, this paper that I read tonight was just boiled down to the idea that, look, man, we can't view Africa with European eyes, right? And this is something that we've been talking about for some weeks now on this show. We cannot continue to go about our work, our lives, our existence using this European view of ourselves. Yeah, I did interview Campbell. So that's the thing. It comes back to the knowledge, it comes back to the education. And once you understand yourself, then the remainder of the work isn't as difficult. And this is the last, one of the last things I'll say. Outside of the continent, we have Africans like us on this episode tonight, in the chat room and what have you, who are working to, make themselves a better African, make who are working to create a better Africa, who are doing the the necessary learnings, the necessary works and stuff like that. Now my question is, and double question mark. It was Obadell. Sorry, not Kamal. Obadell. My question to double question mark is, maybe they know or don't know. I'm not sure. But what are the African folks doing on the continent? Yeah, only time I say is correct. It was Obadell Campbell, right? What are who are the people doing the work in the continent? I don't care what country in the continent, but who are the people in the continent doing the work? Who are the people we should be connecting with, we should be talking to, we should be strategizing with and thinking together with? Can double question mark or anyone else in the chat room give me some names in that respect? I mean, Cambone is one person, I guess. Obadell is a person you could connect with. But who else? Who else in the continent? You say you're from, I think you say you're from Ghana, right? Who in Ghana are the people we should be listening to more? We should be, talking to more. I'll wait around to see if I get an answer to that question. In the meantime, though, let me remind you guys about the podcast network, the shows on the podcast.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
This is DAX. You tune into the Harsh Reality Podcast, providing you with social commentary on the news affecting our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-black perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
All right. I'm back. About to finish up this episode, and double question mark says, I don't know quite well, but I always see struggle. But I think we should work with the citizens of Africa, especially the poor, because the rich don't care. Well, it's been established that Africa's elite has just sold out completely, and Africa's leadership. And again, it's because of them continuing the history, right? This colonial history. They've been continuing it. They've been educated in it, and so that's where we're going to have a lot of problems with converting. Right? Africa needs conversion. We're going to have a lot of problems with that conversion. Only to say from the pro-black perspective says Arikana Chiambori. Hope I pronounced that right. Arikana Chiambori. That's someone I'll look into. Is Arikana Chiambori, like, can I look down? Is this a person with books? Is a person with YouTube entries or social media? How do we get to know more about Arikana Chiambori? Double question mark says the rich Africans don't care about Africa. They are just enjoying their money, but we have to work with the poor people of Africa. Africa needs a black renaissance. I agree. I don't want to discredit the work that ones might be doing on the continent. So this is why I want to know who's the current folks on the continent. And see, that's the other thing. Like, and I've said this before on this show, even about myself. Being that I'm from the Caribbean, I've lived in America for some time now. You know, a lot of what we do, a lot of what I engage with is kind of American centered. And my knowledge, my familiarity with folks on the ground on the continent is limited. So sometimes, being that I'm not on the continent and I haven't returned to the continent yet, you know, you might feel like you're not seeing or hearing from folks like ourselves, when in reality, there are folks doing the work, and we should know those names. Just like they should know our names, we should know their names. Right? Onita says that Arikana Chiambori is the ambassador. Okay. Yeah. So anyway, that's the thing that we need to work on. That's the thing that I need to work on. Let me speak for myself. That's the thing that I need to work on. And for those of you who have information, who have the names, who have the links, for folks on the continent, that's what I want really next. I want to talk to our people on the continent who are, you know, who have grown up, who are immersed in the tradition, who have seen the effects of, you know, colonialism up front, who are dealing with the leaders that came up through, you know, colonialism and received that colonial education and still carrying out the works of the colonists and the works of the rich or the elite in the countries who still have that, you know, that colonizer mindset, right? I want to talk to those people who are dealing with it on a regular basis. And it'll be nice if you guys could help point me in those folks' direction. I'd like to start to make links with folks like that. You got to link with the people before you can work with them, before you can show up in their respective countries on the continent of Africa. You got to establish a connection. And so hopefully that's something that we can do, and I could have more people from the continent appear on the show. And we really just break down what's going on and learn a little bit more of the history of the peoples and the movements on the continent. Like I said, I'll be back on Saturday. I have a paper. Tonight's paper was just okay. You could have said everything you had to say in those 3 or 4 last sentences. But again, you know, the idea is that, look, if these Eurasian folks, right, are studying the continent, why aren't you studying the continent, right? If they can do it, we should be doing it as well. And so hopefully when I read through the papers and I read through certain names of peoples, etc., I hope that it inspires you to look up these groups of Africans, right? Donaldson says that Arikana Chiambori, she was ambassador for the African Union, but was dismissed after her critique of France and exploitation of the continent. Oh, that starts to ring a bell. That starts to ring a bell. And it shouldn't just ring a bell. I'm kind of embarrassed to say that it rings a bell, but yes, that does ring a bell. And again, that's what I'm saying. Like, we gotta, me first, gotta start paying attention to and understanding what's going on the continent better. Okay. So guys, that's the episode tonight. If you have suggestions, since I got some ears and eyes, so you have suggestions about future shows you want me to do, future people you want me to interview, because I like to interview people. So if you have ideas for folks you'd like me to interview, maybe it's someone you follow on social media that you could create and establish the link for me or what have you, let me know. In the top right corner on the screen, you can see the email address. You can see the number to text me at. You can text me and let me know of anyone you think should be on the show, especially people from the continent itself, people putting in the work. And until next time, guys, this has been the Bitter Medicine Podcast. I will be here on Saturday, so make sure you tune in. Peace.
Thanks for listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast with your host, Koku. If you like what you just heard, we hope you pass along our web address, bittermedicineblogs.com, to your friends and colleagues, and share our show to all your social media. Be sure to check out our archive section on our website for previous podcasts. This has been a KWAZ radio production. Join us next time for another session of the Bitter Medicine Podcast. Follow us on Facebook at Bitter Medicine Show, Twitter, Bitter Meds, Tumblr, Bitter Meds, Instagram, Bitter Medicine.